They called him the Iron Duke, a man whose first wife died screaming his name. Now he'd bought her. Rowan Ashford stood in the drawing room of her family's crumbling estate, staring at the marriage contract that had just sold her future to a monster. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. Her mother dabbed tears that meant nothing. And outside, through frost-bitten windows, she could see the black carriage waiting, his carriage, ready to carry her to a fate worse than death. But Rowan Ashford had never been good at doing what she was told. If you want to see how a woman with nothing but her pride survives a marriage designed to break her, stay until the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The drawing room smelled of old wood and older shame. Rowan stood perfectly still, her riding boots muddy on the Persian rug her mother had been trying to preserve for 2 decades. She didn't apologize. She didn't move. She simply stared at the 3 people who had decided her life was worth less than their debts. Her father sat behind his desk like a king on a termite-riddled throne, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the contract. Her mother perched on the settee, handkerchief pressed to her lips, performing grief she didn't feel. And her brother, Marcus, golden, careless Marcus, leaned against the fireplace mantel with the satisfied smirk of a man whose problems had just been solved by someone else's sacrifice. "You'll leave at dawn," her father said, his voice hoarse. He still hadn't looked at her. "The Duke's men will come for you. Everything has been arranged." "Everything," Rowan repeated softly, tasting the word like poison. "Except my consent," her mother gasped. "Rowan, don't be vulgar." "Vulgar?" Rowan's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "You've sold me to a man I've never met, and you're worried about vulgarity." "Sold is such an ugly word," Marcus drawled, examining his fingernails. "Think of it as a strategic alliance." "Strategic for whom?" Rowan took a step forward, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "For father, who gambled away 3 estates? For you, who spent mother's jewelry on mistresses and horse races? Or for me, the daughter you're trading like livestock?" "That's enough." Her father's fist slammed down on the desk, rattling the ink pot. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were bloodshot, desperate. "Do you think I want this? Do you think I take pleasure in this?" "I think," Rowan said quietly, "that you take pleasure in nothing except avoiding the consequences of your own weakness." The silence that followed was absolute. Her mother stood abruptly, wringing her handkerchief between pale fingers. "You don't understand what you're saving us from. The creditors were going to take everything. The house, the land, the name," Rowan finished. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Preserving the Ashford name. Well, I hope it keeps you warm at night, Mother, because I won't be here to do it." She turned to leave. "Rowan." Her father's voice stopped her at the door. "The Duke of Viront is not a cruel man. Stern, perhaps, difficult, but he's honorable. He'll provide for you, protect you." Rowan looked back over her shoulder. "And what makes you think I need protecting?" She didn't wait for an answer. The stables were her sanctuary. Rowan pushed open the heavy wooden door and breathed in the familiar scent of hay, leather, and horse. Here, at least, things made sense. Here, loyalty wasn't bought and sold. It was earned. "Miss Rowan?" She turned to find Samuel, the head groom, emerging from one of the stalls. He was past 60, with weathered skin and kind eyes that had seen her grow from a wild child into a wilder woman. "I heard," he said simply. Rowan nodded, not trusting her voice. "The Iron Duke," Samuel continued, moving to stand beside her. "That's what they call him, Callum Viront. Built half the rail lines in the Western Territories. They say he's harder than the steel he sells." "They say a lot of things." Rowan ran her hand along the stable door, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her palm. "They say his first wife died in childbirth. They say he locked himself away for a year afterward. They say he never smiles. They say he's looking for an heir, a second chance. Then he's bought the wrong woman." Rowan's voice was bitter. "I won't be bred like a mare to continue some legacy I don't believe in." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then carefully he said, "Your mother was 17 when she married your father. Did you know that?" Rowan frowned. "What does that have to—" "She fought it too." Told her parents she'd rather die than marry a man who cared more about land than love. Samuel's weathered face creased into something sad. But she did it anyway, and look what it made her. The implication hung between them like smoke. "I'm not my mother," Rowan said fiercely. "No," Samuel agreed. "You're not. You're stronger, which means you have a choice she never did." "What choice?" "I'm being shipped off like cargo tomorrow morning." "The choice," Samuel said, "of who you become when you get there. You can let this break you, make you small and bitter like it did her, or you can survive it, fight it, bend it to your will." Rowan wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the injustice of a world where her only choice was how gracefully she could endure her own captivity. But instead she found herself asking, "What do you know about Viront Estate?" Samuel's expression shifted, became distant. "It's north. High country. They say the winter there can kill a man if he's not careful. The Duke's lands stretch for miles, timber, mining, rail. He built an empire in the wilderness. And the house? Big, cold, empty, from what I hear." Samuel paused. "His first wife, Lady Catherine, she was from the city. Delicate. They say the isolation drove her mad long before the childbirth took her." "A delicate city flower," Rowan murmured. "And now he's bought a thorn." She spent the rest of the afternoon riding. Her mare, Tempest, was getting old, but she still had fire in her blood. They rode hard across the frozen fields, jumping stone walls and frozen streams, racing against the dying light. When Rowan finally returned to the house, she was mud-splattered and wind-burned, her hair wild around her shoulders. Her mother took one look at her and wept. "How can you be so cavalier?" she demanded. "You leave tomorrow to meet your husband, and you look like a stable hand." "Perhaps that's who I am," Rowan said, stripping off her gloves. "You're an Ashford." "No, Mother. After tomorrow I'll be a Viront, and then I suppose I'll be whoever the Duke wants me to be." The cruelty of it landed like she'd intended. Her mother flinched, fresh tears spilling down her powdered cheeks. Rowan didn't apologize. She climbed the stairs to her room and began to pack. She didn't sleep. How could she? Tomorrow her life as she knew it would end. Tomorrow she would belong to a stranger. Tomorrow she would leave behind everything familiar and step into the unknown. Rowan sat by her window, watching the moon cast silver light across the frozen gardens. She thought about running. She'd done it before, packed a bag, saddled Tempest, and disappeared for 3 days when she was 16. Her father had been furious. Her mother had taken to her bed with nerves. But where would she go now? She had no money, no prospects, no allies willing to shelter her from the consequences of breaking a contract her family had already spent the payment for. No. Running was a fantasy. The only way out was through. Just before dawn, Rowan dressed herself in her riding habit, practical dark green wool, nothing like the elaborate gowns her mother had insisted on packing. She braided her dark hair severely, pinned it at the nape of her neck, and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like a woman going to war. Good. The carriages arrived as the sun broke over the horizon. 2 of them, one for Rowan, one for her belongings. They were black lacquered things, expensive and imposing, with the Viront crest emblazoned on the doors, a mountain peak crossed by iron rails. The driver was a stern-faced man in his 50s who introduced himself as Crawford. He didn't smile, didn't make small talk, simply helped load her trunks and held the carriage door open with mechanical efficiency. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice gravel and formality. Rowan looked back at the house one last time. Her father stood in the doorway, trying to look dignified. Her mother sobbed into her handkerchief. Marcus hadn't even bothered to come downstairs. No one said goodbye. She climbed into the carriage without a word. The journey took 3 days. They traveled north, into territory Rowan had only seen on maps. The rolling farmland of her childhood gave way to rocky hills, then dense forest, then finally the stark, brutal beauty of the high country. Crawford maintained a professional distance, speaking only when necessary. But on the second evening, as they stopped at a roadside inn, Rowan cornered him in the stable yard. "Tell me about him," she demanded. "The Duke. What's he really like?" Crawford considered her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "That's not my place, miss. I'm going to marry him tomorrow. I think I have a right to know what kind of man I'm being given to." Something flickered across Crawford's face. Respect, maybe, or pity. The Duke is complicated. Everyone's complicated. Be specific. Crawford sighed, glancing around to make sure they were alone. He's fair, demands excellence but pays well, doesn't tolerate fools or liars. Since Lady Catherine's death, he's been... He paused, searching for words. Distant, focused on work. Some say he's married to his empire now. Others say he's still mourning. And what do you say? I say, Crawford replied carefully, that a man who's suffered loss either becomes bitter or becomes careful. The Duke chose careful. Whether that's better or worse, I couldn't tell you. It wasn't much, but it was more than Rowan had known before. On the third day, the landscape changed dramatically. The forest opened up into vast snow-dusted plains, and in the distance Rowan could see mountains, real mountains, their peaks white against the gray winter sky. Viront lands, Crawford said, the first time he'd spoken without being prompted. Everything from here to the horizon. Timber, mining, 3 rail lines. The Duke controls it all. Rowan stared out the window, trying to comprehend the scale of it. This wasn't a gentleman's country estate. This was a kingdom, and somewhere in the heart of it was the man who now owned her. The house came into view just as the sun began to set. It was massive, a sprawling stone mansion built into the side of a mountain, with tall windows that caught the dying light like cold fire. There was nothing soft about it, no gentle curves or decorative flourishes. It was built for function, for defense, for endurance. It looked like a fortress. Viront Manor, Crawford announced as the carriage rolled through iron gates. Your new home, miss. Rowan's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face impassive. She would not show fear, would not show weakness. Whatever waited for her inside those stone walls, she would face it standing. The carriage stopped. Crawford opened the door. Rowan stepped out into the cold mountain air and came face to face with the man she was supposed to marry. Callum Viront was not what she expected. She'd imagined someone older, perhaps, grizzled and hard from years of frontier living. But the man standing on the steps of his fortress was young, barely 30, if that, with dark hair, sharp features, and eyes the color of winter storms. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in simple but expensive clothing that spoke of wealth worn without vanity. There was a scar along his left jaw, faint but visible, and his hands, when she looked at them, were not the soft hands of aristocracy, but the calloused hands of a man who worked. He studied her with the same clinical intensity she was using on him. Miss Ashford, he said. His voice was deep, controlled, with an edge of the frontier roughness that no amount of education could fully erase. I trust your journey was acceptable. It was a journey, Rowan replied, her tone carefully neutral. I'm here. I suppose that's what matters. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement? Irritation? It was impossible to tell. Indeed. He descended the steps, moving with the controlled grace of a predator. Welcome to Viront Manor. I'll have Mrs. Brennan show you to your rooms. We'll speak in the morning about the arrangements. Arrangements, Rowan echoed. You mean the marriage? Among other things. They stared at each other in the fading light, two strangers bound by a contract neither had asked for. Finally, Callum turned and gestured to a severe-looking woman in her 50s who had appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Brennan, this is Miss Ashford. See that she has everything she needs. Of course, Your Grace. He didn't look at Rowan again, simply climbed the steps and disappeared into the house, leaving her standing in the cold with a housekeeper who looked like she'd never smiled in her life. This way, miss, Mrs. Brennan said crisply. Rowan followed her inside. The interior of Viront Manor was as imposing as its exterior. High ceilings, dark wood, stone floors. Everything was immaculate, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. It felt more like a museum than a home. The Duke keeps specific hours, Mrs. Brennan explained as they climbed a wide staircase. Breakfast at 6 in his study, dinner at 8 in the dining room if he's not working late. He doesn't appreciate disruption to his schedule. How accommodating of him, Rowan murmured. Mrs. Brennan's lips thinned. The household runs on discipline and efficiency, Miss Ashford. I suggest you learn that quickly. They reached the second floor and walked down a long corridor lined with closed doors. Finally, Mrs. Brennan stopped and pushed open a door near the end. "Your rooms!" Rowan stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The suite was beautiful. There was no denying that. A large bedroom with windows overlooking the mountains, a sitting room with a fireplace already lit, a private bathing room with modern plumbing. The furniture was elegant, the fabrics rich, but it was also a cage. She could feel it in the careful arrangement of everything, the way the door locked from the outside as well as the inside, the windows that looked out on nothing but wilderness for miles. "Dinner will be sent up," Mrs. Brennan said. "The Duke felt you might prefer to rest after your journey." Translation: He didn't want to deal with her tonight. "How thoughtful," Rowan said flatly. Mrs. Brennan hesitated at the door. "A word of advice, miss. The Duke appreciates directness. If you have concerns or questions, address them plainly. He has no patience for games." "And what about defiance?" Rowan asked. "How does he feel about that?" The housekeeper's expression turned glacial. "I wouldn't recommend testing that theory." She left, closing the door behind her with a decisive click. Rowan stood alone in her beautiful prison and felt the full weight of her situation settle over her like snow. She walked to the window and pressed her palm against the cold glass. Outside, the sun had finally set, leaving the mountains dark against a star-scattered sky. It was breathtaking, brutal, unforgiving, like the man she was supposed to marry. Rowan closed her eyes and made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would not break. She would not become another tragic story whispered by servants, the second wife who couldn't handle the isolation, the cold, the Iron Duke's iron will. She would fight. And if Callum Viront thought he'd bought a compliant, grateful bride, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. She didn't see him again until the wedding. It was held in the Manor's small chapel, with only Mrs. Brennan and Crawford as witnesses. No flowers, no music, no pretense that this was anything other than a transaction. The officiant, a nervous pastor from the nearest town, rushed through the ceremony like he was afraid the Duke might change his mind. Rowan stood in a simple white dress that Mrs. Brennan had laid out for her, feeling numb. Callum stood beside her in a dark suit, his face expressionless. "Do you, Callum Viront, take this woman?" "I do." "And do you, Rowan Ashford, take this man?" She looked at Callum, really looked at him. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He looked like a man performing an unpleasant duty. Something hot and furious sparked in her chest. "I do," she said, putting every ounce of defiance she felt into those two words. His eyes flicked to her, sharp with warning. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." The pastor practically ran from the chapel. Callum turned to face her. "Mrs. Viront." "Your Grace," she replied coldly. They stood there, two adversaries in wedding clothes, the ink barely dry on a contract that bound them together. "There will be a small dinner tonight," Callum said. "Some business associates. You'll attend." It wasn't a question. "Of course," Rowan said. "I wouldn't want to disrupt your schedule." His eyes narrowed. "If you have something to say, say it." "What would you like me to say?" She smiled, sharp as broken glass. "Thank you for purchasing me? Thank you for giving me the honor of becoming the second Mrs. Viront? Thank you for this beautiful prison you've built?" "This isn't a prison." "No?" Rowan laughed, bitter and bright. "Then what is it?" Callum stepped closer, and she realized for the first time how much taller he was, how much space he took up. But Rowan didn't back down, didn't flinch. "It's a partnership," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your family needed resources. I needed an heir. We both get what we need. I didn't need anything from you." "Then you should have refused." "I wasn't given the choice." Something flickered across his face, something that might have been guilt or regret, or just irritation at having to deal with an inconvenient truth. "You're here now," he said finally. "We can make this civil or we can make it hell. Your choice." "Civil," Rowan repeated. "How romantic." "Romance," Callum said coldly, "was never part of the arrangement." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the chapel, still wearing his ring. Rowan looked down at it, A simple gold band, expensive but unadorned. A symbol of ownership, not love. She twisted it on her finger, feeling its weight. Then she lifted her chin and walked out into her new life, ready for war. Alt. The dinner that night was exactly as miserable as she'd anticipated. 4 men, business associates of the Duke, sat around the long dining table discussing rail expansion, mining yields, and timber contracts. Rowan sat at the opposite end from Callum, dressed in a gown Mrs. Brennan had selected, smiling politely when spoken to and otherwise being ignored. She was a decoration, a trophy wife to show that the Iron Duke was moving forward, putting the past behind him. It made her want to scream. "And your wife," one of the men, Harrison, a portly investor from back east, said jovially. "Quite a beauty, Viront. You're a lucky man." Callum's expression didn't change. "Thank you." "Tell me, Mrs. Viront," Harrison continued, turning his smile on Rowan. "How are you finding the frontier? Quite different from the civilized world, I imagine." "I'm finding it honest," Rowan replied, her voice sweet as poison. "Out here, at least, people don't pretend their transactions are anything other than what they are." The table went silent. Harrison's smile faltered. "I'm not sure I understand." "Don't you?" Rowan set down her wine glass carefully. "In the city, they dress up business arrangements in romance and tradition. Here, we're more direct. My husband needed an heir. My family needed money. A transaction was made. Everyone got what they wanted. Except me, she didn't say. But the words hung in the air anyway. Callum's knuckles had gone white around his fork. "My wife," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is still adjusting to her new circumstances. You'll have to forgive her directness." "Nothing to forgive," Rowan said brightly. "As you said, you appreciate plain speaking." Their eyes locked across the table, a silent battle of wills. One of the other men coughed awkwardly. Harrison laughed nervously. The dinner limped along for another excruciating hour before the guests finally made their excuses and left. The moment the door closed behind them, Callum turned to her. "What the hell was that?" "That," Rowan said, standing, "was honesty. I thought you appreciated it." "There's honesty and there's sabotage." "Sabotage?" She laughed. "I simply stated facts. If that embarrasses you, you embarrassed yourself." He crossed the room in 3 strides, looming over her. "These men control contracts worth millions. Their good opinion matters." "To you," Rowan shot back, "not to me. You are my wife now. What affects me affects you. I am your wife in name only. Don't pretend this is anything more than a business arrangement. You said so yourself. Romance was never part of it." They stood toe-to-toe, breathing hard, the tension between them crackling like lightning before a storm. "Go to your room," Callum said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Gladly." Rowan swept past him, her skirts rustling, her heart pounding. She made it to the staircase before his voice stopped her. "Rowan." She paused, not turning. "I didn't want this either." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Rowan looked back over her shoulder. Callum stood in the doorway of the dining room, silhouetted against the light, looking suddenly, impossibly tired. "Then why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "Because some cages," he said. "We build ourselves." He disappeared into his study before she could respond. Rowan climbed the stairs to her beautiful prison and wondered for the first time if she and the Iron Duke might have more in common than she'd thought, and whether that made things better or infinitely worse. The first week of marriage passed in a cold war of silence. Rowan learned the rhythms of Viront Manor quickly. Not because anyone taught her, but because survival demanded observation. The Duke rose before dawn and disappeared into his study or rode out to inspect his operations. Mrs. Brennan ran the household with military precision. The handful of servants moved through the halls like ghosts, efficient and invisible. And Rowan was left to wander her gilded cage, searching for purpose in a place that had no use for her. She found it unexpectedly in the stables. They were nothing like the modest barn at her family's estate. These stables housed 30 horses. Sleek thoroughbreds for riding, massive draft horses for hauling timber, and several mean-looking Mustangs that the stablemaster, a grizzled man named Pike, insisted were too wild for anyone but the Duke. Rowan took that as a challenge. "Ma'am, I wouldn't," Pike said nervously as she approached the stall of a particularly aggressive black stallion. "That one's Havoc. He's thrown 4 men this month. The Duke's the only one who can handle him." "Then perhaps," Rowan said, slipping into the stall with practiced ease, "your men don't know how to listen." Pike's protests faded as Rowan stood perfectly still, letting the stallion come to her. Havoc snorted, stamped, tested her with a warning nip that she deflected calmly. She didn't flinch, didn't try to dominate, just breathed steady and waited. After 10 minutes, the horse allowed her to touch his neck. After 20, she had a bridle on him. Pike stood slack-jawed as Rowan led Havoc out of the stall. "I'll be damned." "I'll take him out," Rowan said. "Ma'am, the Duke gave specific orders." "The Duke," Rowan interrupted, "can take his orders and what exactly?" She turned to find Callum standing in the stable doorway, dressed in riding clothes, his expression thunderous. "Your Grace," Pike stammered. I tried to stop her." Callum held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes never left Rowan's face. "Leave us." Pike fled like the building was on fire. Rowan stood her ground, one hand still on Havoc's reins. The stallion shifted restlessly beside her, sensing the tension. "I gave explicit instructions," Callum said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that Havoc was not to be handled by anyone but me." "Your instructions," Rowan replied, "were not given to me. They apply to everyone in this household. I'm not everyone." She met his gaze steadily. "And I'm certainly not incompetent. I've been riding since before I could walk." "On what? Gentle mares and retired geldings?" Callum moved closer, and Havoc's ears flattened. "That animal has put men in the hospital." "Then your men are fools." The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown. Callum's jaw tightened. "Get away from him." "No, that's not a request. And I'm not one of your employees to be ordered around." Rowan stroked Havoc's neck, and the stallion settled slightly under her touch. "I spent a week in that house with nothing to do but arrange flowers and pretend to read books I've already finished. I need this." "What you need," Callum said coldly, "is to learn your place." Something snapped inside Rowan. "My place?" She laughed, sharp and bitter. "What place would that be exactly? The decorative wife who sits quietly at dinners? The breeding stock you purchased to give you an heir? Tell me, Your Grace, which role am I supposed to play today?" Callum's eyes went dark. "You have no idea." "You're right. I don't. Because you won't talk to me. You won't even look at me unless you're forced to." Rowan's voice cracked, just slightly, before she wrestled it back under control. "I'm stuck here, in this place with you, for the rest of my life. The least you could do is let me have the horses." Silence stretched between them, broken only by Havoc's restless breathing. Then, unexpectedly, Callum said, "Show me." Rowan blinked. "What?" "Show me you can handle him. Ride him. If you make it back without breaking your neck, you can ride whatever horses you want." It was a test, a challenge, and they both knew it. Rowan smiled, cold and fierce. "Saddle or bareback?" Something flickered in Callum's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or reluctant respect. "Your choice. Bareback, then." She swung onto Havoc's back in one fluid motion, and the stallion immediately tried to buck her off. Rowan held on with her thighs, moving with the animal's rage instead of fighting it, letting him expend his fury until he realized she wasn't going to be intimidated. Then she leaned forward and whispered something in his ear. Havoc stilled. Rowan looked down at Callum, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Open the gate." He did. Rowan and Havoc exploded out of the stable yard at a dead gallop, racing across the frozen fields toward the tree line. The wind tore at her hair, her face, her lungs. She felt wild, reckless, alive for the first time since she'd arrived at this godforsaken place. Havoc ran like he was trying to outrun demons. Rowan let him. They rode hard for an hour, until both of them were trembling with exhaustion. Then, slowly, she guided him back toward the manor. Callum was still waiting in the stable yard, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Rowan slid off Havoc's back and led him, docile now, into his stall. She rubbed him down carefully, gave him water and feed, all while Callum watched in silence. Finally, As she latched the stall door, he spoke. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" "My home," Rowan said, not looking at him. "Before you bought it out from under me." The barb landed. She could see it in the tightening of his shoulders. "I didn't—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "Your family's debts were going to destroy them. I offered a solution. A solution that benefited you. Business always benefits someone. And what about me?" Rowan turned to face him fully. "Did anyone ask what would benefit me?" Callum stared at her, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer, might actually acknowledge the injustice of what had been done to her. Instead, he said, "You can ride the horses, but if you get hurt, I won't. If you do," he continued, ignoring her interruption, "don't expect sympathy." "I wouldn't dream of it, Your Grace." He left without another word, but something had shifted between them. Some invisible line had been drawn and crossed. Rowan didn't know if that made things better or worse. That night, for the first time, Callum joined her for dinner. Not in the formal dining room, but in a smaller room off the kitchen that the servants used for their meals. He appeared just as she was finishing, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. "I thought," he said, setting the glasses down, "we should talk." Rowan raised an eyebrow. "About?" "The arrangement." He poured 2 generous measures. "You were right. This situation is unconventional, and I haven't made it easier." It was the closest thing to an apology she was going to get, she realized. "No," she agreed, accepting the glass he offered. "You haven't." They drank in silence for a moment. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, honest and clean. "I need you to understand something," Callum said finally. "This estate, everything I've built, it requires constant attention. The mines, the timber operations, the rail lines. If I'm not vigilant, people get hurt. Money gets lost. Systems fail. So you work yourself to death and call it duty." His eyes flashed. "What would you have me do?" "Live," Rowan said simply. "Instead of just surviving." Callum looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something crack in his carefully maintained armor. "Living," he said quietly, "is dangerous. So is this." She gestured between them. "2 strangers forced together, pretending we can coexist without destroying each other. I don't want to destroy you." "Then stop trying to control me." He leaned back, studying her. "And if I can't?" "Then this war between us will never end." Rowan met his gaze steadily. "Is that what you want? A wife who hates you? A home that feels like a battlefield?" "I want—" He stopped, seemed to wrestle with something internal. "I want peace, order, a life that makes sense." "Life doesn't make sense," Rowan said. It just happens, and we either adapt or we break." Callum's laugh was bitter. "You sound like someone who's done a lot of breaking." "I've done my share," she finished her whiskey. "But I'm still here. So am I." They looked at each other across the scarred wooden table, 2 damaged people trying to figure out if they could build something from the wreckage of their forced union. "A truce," Callum said finally. "For now." "A truce," Rowan agreed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The truce lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, a man named Garrett arrived at the estate, a mine foreman from one of Callum's operations in the Northern Territories. He was loud, crude, and treated Rowan like a decorative object whenever Callum's back was turned. She tolerated it through dinner, through drinks afterward, through the man's increasingly inappropriate comments disguised as compliments. But when Garrett cornered her in the hallway outside the drawing room and put his hand on her waist, Rowan's tolerance evaporated. "Remove your hand," she said quietly, "or lose it." Garrett laughed, whiskey bold. "The Duke's little wife has claws. I like that." He leaned closer, and Rowan drove her knee into his groin with practiced efficiency. Garrett went down like a felled tree, wheezing. "I warned you," Rowan said calmly, stepping over him. She made it 3 steps before Callum appeared, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene, Garrett on the floor, gasping, Rowan standing over him, looking utterly unrepentant, and his expression went carefully blank. "What happened?" "Your foreman," Rowan said. Forgot his manners. I reminded him. Garrett struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. That bitch attacked me. She's insane. Watch your mouth, Callum said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. She assaulted me. In your own house. In your... Callum looked at Rowan. Is that true? He touched me without permission, she replied evenly. I defended myself. She's lying, Garrett sputtered. I was just being friendly. Were you? Callum's gaze shifted to his foreman, cold as winter. Because Mrs. Viront doesn't strike me as someone who acts without provocation. Garrett's bluster faltered. Your Grace, you can't seriously believe. I can, and I do. Callum's voice could have cut steel. Get out. You're dismissed from my service. What? You can't. I've worked for you for 5 years, and in 5 seconds I'll have you thrown out bodily if you don't leave on your own. Callum didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The threat was clear in every word. Garrett looked between them, realized he'd lost, and stormed out, cursing under his breath. The moment the door slammed, Callum turned to Rowan. Are you hurt? The question surprised her. No. Good. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking exhausted. I apologize. Garrett's always been rough around the edges, but I didn't think... You didn't think he'd try something with your wife standing right there, Rowan finished, because in your world, men like him respect ownership, even if they don't respect women. Callum's jaw tightened. That's not... Isn't it? She crossed her arms. You fired him for disrespecting your property, not for violating a person. I fired him, Callum said tightly, because he put his hands on you. Don't twist this into something it's not. I'm not twisting anything. I'm just stating facts. They stared at each other, the fragile truce between them cracking under the weight of unspoken resentments. Why do you do that? Callum asked finally. Do what? Turn every conversation into a battle. He stepped closer, and Rowan had to resist the urge to step back. I defended you. I believed you. I fired a valuable employee because he made you uncomfortable, and somehow I'm still the villain in your story. You're not a villain, Rowan said quietly. You're just a man who thinks protection and possession are the same thing. The words hung between them like smoke. Callum's expression shifted. Anger, frustration, and something else she couldn't name. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Rowan took a step forward, closing the distance between them. You built this empire, this fortress, these walls, and you think if you control everything inside them, you'll be safe. But you won't, because control is just another word for fear. And what are you afraid of? He shot back. Becoming like you. The blow landed harder than her knee to Garrett's groin. She could see it in the way Callum's face went white, then carefully, deliberately blank. Get some rest, he said, his voice flat. We're hosting the regional council tomorrow. I'll need you presentable. Of course, Your Grace. Wouldn't want to embarrass you. She swept past him, her heart pounding, feeling both victorious and hollow. The regional council meeting was a nightmare. 6 men, landowners and business leaders from the surrounding territories, gathered in Callum's study to discuss water rights, timber contracts, and railway expansion. Rowan was relegated to serving tea and looking decorative. She hated every second of it, especially when one of the council members, a snake of a man named Thwarting, started talking about the Indian problem in the Northern Territories. They're squatting on valuable land, Thwarting said, accepting a cigar from Callum. It's slowing down expansion. We need to push them out. Those are their ancestral lands, Rowan said before she could stop herself. The room went silent. Thwarting turned to her with an oily smile. I'm sorry, Mrs. Viront. I didn't realize you had an opinion on business matters. I have an opinion on basic human decency, Rowan replied, which seems to be in short supply in this room. Callum's eyes flashed a warning. Rowan, no. She set down the tea tray with more force than necessary. These men want to displace families who've lived on that land for generations. For what? Profit? For progress, Thwarting corrected smoothly. Surely you understand that civilization requires difficult choices. Civilization, Rowan said, her voice shaking with anger, shouldn't be built on stolen land and broken promises. Another council member laughed uncomfortably. The Duke's bride has a soft heart. The Duke's bride, Callum said, standing, has said quite enough. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us. He gripped Rowan's elbow and steered her out of the study before she could protest. The moment they were in the hallway, he released her like she'd burned him. What the hell was that? He demanded. That was me refusing to sit quietly while you and your friends discussed destroying people's lives. This isn't your concern. Everything that happens in this house is my concern. Rowan's voice rose. You want me to play the perfect wife? Fine, but I won't smile and nod while you plan atrocities. Atrocities? Callum's laugh was harsh. You have no idea what you're talking about. This is how business works, how empires are built. On the backs of people with less power? Rowan shook her head. Then maybe your empire isn't worth building. You're being naive. And you're being cruel. They stood in the hallway, both breathing hard, both too angry to back down. Those men in there, Callum said finally, his voice tight, control resources I need. Rail access, timber rights, mining permits. If I alienate them, then you'll have to find another way. Rowan met his gaze. Or you can continue sacrificing your principles for profit, but don't expect me to participate. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. My first wife thought like you. Rowan froze. Catherine, Callum continued, his voice rough. She hated the business, hated what it required, said it was turning me into someone she didn't recognize. He laughed bitterly. Maybe she was right. What happened to her? Rowan asked quietly, still not turning around. She died trying to prove I could be something I'm not. The pain in his voice was so raw, so unexpected, that Rowan finally looked back. Callum stood in the hallway looking lost. Not the Iron Duke, not the ruthless businessman, just a man haunted by ghosts. I can't change the world, he said. I can barely manage what I've built. And I can't, his voice cracked. I can't lose someone else trying. Rowan understood then. His control, his coldness, his walls, they weren't about power, they were about survival. I'm not Catherine, she said gently. No, Callum agreed. You're not. You're stronger, which makes you more dangerous. To whom? To me. Before Rowan could respond, the study door opened and Thwarting appeared. Your Grace, we're ready to resume. Callum's mask slipped back into place instantly. Of course, Mrs. Viront was just leaving. He walked back into the study without looking at her. Rowan stood alone in the hallway, her heart pounding, feeling like she'd just glimpsed something important, and watched it disappear before she could grasp it. That night, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Rowan lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the manor, rattling windows and making the whole structure groan. She'd never heard anything like it. The storms back home had been gentle compared to this elemental fury. Around midnight, the power went out. Then the screaming started. Rowan bolted upright, her heart hammering. The sound was coming from somewhere below, raw, terrified screaming that raised every hair on her body. She grabbed a robe and ran into the hallway just as Callum emerged from his room, pulling on a shirt. Stay here, he ordered. Like hell. She followed him down the stairs toward the kitchen, where Mrs. Brennan stood with a lantern, her face white. It's the mine shaft, the housekeeper said. The old entrance behind the west wing. The storm must have destabilized it. Pike was checking the horses when he heard the collapse. Callum swore viciously. Who's down there? Two of the stable hands. They were moving supplies before the storm hit. Callum was already moving, grabbing a coat and boots. Get rope, lanterns, medical supplies. Your Grace, you can't go down there, Mrs. Brennan protested. The whole thing could collapse. Then we don't have time to argue. Rowan grabbed his arm. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. You need someone who can fit through tight spaces and isn't afraid of heights. She met his gaze steadily. I spent half my childhood climbing through barn lofts and hay lofts. I can help. This isn't a game, Rowan. I know that. She grabbed a lantern. Those men are screaming. We're wasting time. Callum stared at her for one long moment. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. They ran through the storm toward the west wing, where Pike waited with two other men. The entrance to the old mine shaft was partially collapsed, rocks and timber blocking most of the opening. How stable is it? Callum shouted over the wind. Not very, Pike shouted back. Could go completely any minute. Callum swore again and started pulling rocks away from the entrance. Rowan joined him, her hands quickly becoming bloody as she worked. After 10 minutes of frantic digging, they'd cleared a gap barely 3 feet wide. I can fit through, Rowan said immediately. No. Callum's voice was flat. I'll go. You won't fit. Your shoulders are too broad. She was already tying a rope around her waist. I'm smaller, faster. Rowan, she looked at him and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or just two stubborn people recognizing each other. I can do this, she said. Callum's jaw clenched. Then he grabbed the rope and tied it himself, checking every knot twice. If anything shifts, you pull on this 3 times. We'll haul you out. Understand? Understood. Rowan squeezed through the gap, scraping her shoulders on the rough stone. The passage beyond was narrow, dark, and terrifying. She could hear the men crying somewhere ahead, could smell dust and fear. I'm coming, she called. Hold on! She crawled forward, the lantern casting wild shadows on the walls. The passage twisted, dropped, became so narrow she had to exhale completely to squeeze through. And then she found them. 2 young men, maybe 20 years old, trapped under a fallen beam. One was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. The other was crying, his leg crushed beneath the timber. Help us, he sobbed. Please, I've got you, Rowan said, forcing calm into her voice. What's your name? Thomas. That's my brother James. He won't wake up. He will. Rowan examined the beam. It was massive, wedged between the ceiling and floor. No way she could lift it alone. She tugged the rope 3 times, then 4, their signal for need more people. Within minutes, Callum squeezed through the gap, followed by Pike. Together, they managed to lever the beam up just enough for Rowan to drag Thomas out. James was harder. Unconscious weight was dead weight, but they got him free. Go, Callum ordered. Get them out. We'll stabilize this. Rowan helped Thomas stumble back through the passage while Pike and Callum worked to shore up the ceiling. She could hear the mountain groaning around them, feel the structure shifting. They made it out just as the entire passage collapsed behind them. Rowan and Thomas tumbled out into the storm, coughing and covered in dust. Mrs. Brennan and the other men rushed forward to help. The Duke, Mrs. Brennan demanded. Pike? Rowan's heart stopped. They were right behind us. Then Callum and Pike emerged from the gap, barely ahead of the final collapse. They'd made it out with seconds to spare. Callum looked at Rowan, his face streaked with dirt and blood, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, really smiled. You're insane, he said. So are you, she replied. They stood in the storm, battered and exhausted, 2 strangers who'd just survived death together, and something fundamental had changed between them. Later, after the brothers had been tended to and the storm had passed, Rowan found Callum in his study, staring at the fire. You should rest, she said from the doorway. So should you. She entered the room and sat in the chair across from him. They were both still filthy, still wearing their ruined clothes. Thank you, Callum said finally, for what you did tonight. Those men would have died if... We did it together, Rowan interrupted. That's the point. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Respect. Recognition. I was wrong about you, he said quietly. Which part? All of it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I thought I was getting another Catherine, someone who'd wilt under the pressure, need protecting. And instead you got someone who'll crawl into a collapsing mine shaft and drag people out by their ankles. His laugh was surprised, genuine. Yes, exactly that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Callum, Rowan said carefully. What happened to Catherine, really? His expression shuddered immediately. I told you. She died in childbirth. That's what happened. I'm asking why. Does it matter? Yes. Rowan leaned forward. Because whatever it is, it's still haunting you. And until you face it, we're never going to be able to move forward. Callum stared into the fire for a long time. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, he said, She begged me not to make her have a child. Rowan's breath caught. She was terrified, Callum continued, his voice hollow. Her mother had died in childbirth. Her grandmother. She thought it was a curse. But I needed an heir. The business required it, so I pushed and pushed until finally she... His voice broke. She died hating me, screaming at me, telling me I'd killed her. Rowan felt tears stinging her eyes. Callum, so when you ask why I keep everyone at arm's length, he looked at her and his eyes were devastated. That's why. Because the one time I let someone close, I destroyed them. Rowan crossed the space between them and knelt in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers. I'm not her, she said fiercely, and you're not the same man you were then. We don't have to repeat the past. Don't we? His laugh was bitter. This whole arrangement, it's built on the same foundation. You're here to give me an heir, to continue the line. How is that any different? Because this time, Rowan said, you're going to give me a choice. Callum stared at her. What? You heard me. This marriage, this life, it only works if we both choose it, every day. Not because a contract says we have to, but because we want to. She squeezed his hands. So I'm asking you, do you want me here? Not as a broodmare, not as an obligation, but as a partner. Someone who'll fight beside you even when you're being an impossible ass. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Even then? Especially then. Callum looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. And if I can't promise you safety, if this life is always going to be hard and dangerous then we'll face it together, Rowan said, like we did tonight. For the first time she saw hope in his eyes. Fragile, tentative, but real. Together, he repeated, testing the word. Together. Callum pulled her up and into his arms, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Rowan wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tightly. Outside, the storm finally broke, and inside Viront Manor, two people who'd been fighting separate wars finally found common ground. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, neither willing to let go first. When Callum finally released her, his hands lingered on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face like he was trying to memorize it. Get some rest, he said, his voice rough. We both need it. Rowan nodded, but as she turned to leave, he caught her hand. Rowan. He hesitated, seeming to wrestle with words. What you did tonight, crawling into that shaft when you had every reason not to, why? Because they needed help, she said simply. And because I could. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. Good night, Callum. She left him standing by the dying fire, looking less like the Iron Duke and more like a man trying to find his way out of a darkness he'd been living in for too long. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Rowan was in the stables with Pike, checking on the horses that had been spooked by the storm, when Crawford appeared looking unusually agitated. Mrs. Viront, the Duke requests your presence in his study, immediately. Something in his tone made her stomach clench. What's happened? Just come, ma'am, please. She followed him back to the house, her mind racing through possibilities. The mine collapse? The injured men? Had one of them taken a turn for the worse? But when she entered Callum's study, she found him standing rigid behind his desk, his face like carved stone. And across from him sat a woman Rowan had never seen before, elegant, in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Ah, the woman said, turning to examine Rowan like she was a horse at auction. So this is the replacement. Lady Viront, Callum said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. May I present my mother, Constance Viront. Mother, my wife, Rowan. Mother. The word hit Rowan like a physical blow. Callum had never mentioned his mother. She'd assumed, like her own parents, that they were distant or dead. Clearly, she'd been wrong. How lovely, Constance said, her smile sharp as a knife. Though I must say, Callum, you could have waited a respectable amount of time before rushing into another marriage. Catherine's been dead barely 2 years. That's enough. Callum's voice could have cut glass. Is it? Constance stood, moving with the grace of someone used to commanding rooms. Because from where I'm standing, this looks remarkably similar to your first mistake. A young woman, completely unsuited to frontier life, brought here to fulfill an obligation she doesn't understand. You know nothing about me, Rowan said quietly. Constance's eyes snapped to her. Don't I? Let me guess. Your family was drowning in debt, and my son offered salvation in exchange for an heir. How am I doing so far? The accuracy stung, but Rowan kept her face impassive. If you came here to insult me, you've succeeded. If you came for any other reason, I suggest you get to it. A flash of surprise crossed Constance's face, followed by something that might have been respect. I came to warn my son against repeating history, but I see he's already made up his mind. He has, Rowan said firmly, and so have I. Then you're both fools. Constance turned back to Callum. This estate, this empire you've built, it demands everything from you. It took your father, it took Catherine, and it will take her too, if you're not careful. Get out, Callum said, his voice dangerously quiet. Callum, get out. He moved around the desk, and for a moment, Rowan thought he might physically remove his own mother from the room. You had no right to come here. No right to speak to my wife that way. I have every right, Constance shot back. I'm trying to save you from yourself. Again. I don't need saving. I need you to leave. Mother and son stared at each other, years of unspoken resentment crackling between them like lightning. Finally, Constance gathered her coat. Very well, but when this ends in tragedy, and it will, don't say I didn't warn you. She swept out of the study, leaving a wake of tension behind her. Callum stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Rowan watched him struggle for control, watched the Iron Duke slam back into place over the vulnerable man she'd glimpsed the night before. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he said finally, not looking at her. Don't apologize for her. Rowan moved closer. What did she mean about your father? His jaw tightened. It doesn't matter. Callum. It doesn't matter, he repeated, harder this time. My mother has opinions about everything and solutions for nothing. Ignore her. But Rowan couldn't ignore the fear she'd seen in Constance's eyes, buried beneath the criticism and contempt. Fear for her son. Fear of history repeating. Did your father die here? She asked carefully. At the estate? Callum's silence was answer enough. How? The same way men die in these territories. Accidents, violence, the land taking what it's owed. He finally looked at her, his eyes haunted. My mother wanted him to sell, to move back east where it was safe. He refused. 3 months later, he was killed in a mining explosion. Rowan felt pieces clicking into place. And Catherine hated it here, begged me to leave, to sell everything and start over somewhere else. His laugh was bitter. I refused, just like my father, and she died, just like my mother predicted. So your mother thinks I'm doomed too. My mother thinks everyone's doomed. It's her specialty. Rowan studied him, seeing the weight of inherited guilt pressing down on his shoulders. You're not your father, Callum. No, he agreed. I'm worse, because I know the cost, and I'm asking you to pay it anyway. Before Rowan could respond, Pike burst into the study without knocking. Your Grace, we've got trouble. Big trouble. Callum's entire demeanor shifted instantly. What kind? The northern timber camp. Riders just came in. There's been an attack. The timber camp was in chaos when they arrived. Rowan had insisted on coming despite Callum's protests, and now she understood why he'd wanted her to stay behind. The camp was a war zone. Buildings burned. Men shouted. And in the center of it all, 3 bodies lay covered with canvas. What happened? Callum demanded, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. The camp foreman, a grizzled man named Michaels, stepped forward. Raiders, Your Grace, came in just after dawn, hit the supply depot, took what they could carry, burned the rest. Raiders? Callum's voice was ice. Or the people we've been trying to displace? Michaels shifted uncomfortably. Hard to say for certain, but it's convenient timing, a new voice interrupted. Rowan turned to see Thwarting emerging from one of the intact buildings, his face smug. Right after your wife's little speech about ancestral lands and human decency. Rowan's blood ran cold. "You can't possibly be suggesting—" she started. "I'm not suggesting anything," Thwarting said smoothly, "just noting the coincidence. You argue against expansion, and suddenly we're under attack. Makes a man think." "Then think about this," Callum said, his voice deadly quiet. "Before you start pointing fingers, remember who owns this operation, and who can shut you out of it completely." Thornton's smile didn't waver. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no disrespect to your lady wife. I'm sure she had nothing to do with giving aid to savages." The word hung in the air like poison. Rowan stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Those savages were here long before you. This is their land." "Rowan," Callum warned. "No." She whirled on him. "I won't stand here and listen to this. You said you wanted honesty, direct conversation. Well, here it is. What we're doing here is wrong. Pushing people off their land, destroying their homes. 3 of my men are dead," Michael shouted. "Good men with families. And how many of their people have died because of us?" Rowan shot back. "How many have been driven from their homes? How many children have starved because we burned their winter stores?" The camp went silent. Every eye was on her, and none of them were friendly. "Mrs. Viront," Thwarting said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I think grief over last night's mine incident has clouded your judgment. Perhaps you should rest." "My judgment is perfectly clear," Rowan said, "and if you think I'm going to what—" "Enough." Callum's voice cracked like a whip. He grabbed Rowan's arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "We're leaving. Now." He practically dragged her back to their horses, away from the watching men. "Let go of me," Rowan hissed. "Not until you get on that horse and ride back to the manor." His face was thunderous. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was thinking someone needed to say it." "Not you! Not here!" He released her arm, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Those men already questioned my judgment. Now you've given them reason to question my control over my own wife." "I'm not something to be controlled." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This is a powder keg, Rowan. Men are dead. Tempers are high. And you just threw a match into the center of it." "Because it needed to be said. Even if it puts you in danger?" His hands gripped her shoulders. "Even if it makes you a target? I can handle—" "No, you can't." His voice cracked. "You have no idea what these men are capable of when they're scared and angry. What they'll do to someone they see as a threat. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you built your empire on stolen land." The words were cruel, and she knew it the moment they left her mouth. Callum's face went white, then carefully, deliberately blank. "Get on your horse," he said quietly. "Go back to the manor. Stay there." "Callum, that's not a request." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone next to her horse, shaking with anger and fear and something else she couldn't name. She rode back to the manor, but she didn't stay there. Instead, she went to find the one person she thought might give her straight answers, Mrs. Brennan. She found the housekeeper in the kitchen, overseeing dinner preparations with her usual military efficiency. "Mrs. Brennan, I need to ask you something about the Northern Territories. The people we're displacing." The housekeeper's expression closed immediately. "That's not my place, ma'am." "Please." Rowan moved closer. "I need to understand what's really happening out there. What Callum, what the Duke, is really doing." Mrs. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, her hands still on the bread dough she'd been kneading. Finally, she said, "What the Duke is doing is surviving, same as everyone else in these territories. The railway needs timber. Timber needs land. Land needs to be cleared." "By force?" "Sometimes." The housekeeper's voice was carefully neutral. "The Duke tries to negotiate, offers payment, relocation assistance, but not everyone accepts. And when they don't, then men like Thwarting take matters into their own hands." Mrs. Brennan finally looked at Rowan. "You need to understand something, ma'am. The Duke is powerful, but he's not all powerful. He's got investors, partners, councils to answer to. If he shows too much weakness, too much sentiment, they'll remove him and put someone worse in his place. So he does terrible things to prevent worse things from happening? He does necessary things in an impossible situation." Mrs. Brennan returned to her kneading. Whether that makes him a good man or just a practical one, I couldn't say. Rowan left the kitchen more confused than when she'd entered. She understood the logic, the brutal mathematics of power and survival, but understanding didn't make it right. She spent the afternoon in the library searching through Callum's papers for information about the Northern Territories. What she found made her stomach turn. Contracts, forced sales, eviction notices, and buried in the files, reports of violence, burnings, beatings, worse, some of it committed by men in Callum's employ, some of it sanctioned, some of it merely overlooked. Looking for something? Rowan jumped, scattering papers. Callum stood in the doorway, still dressed in his riding clothes, covered in soot and looking exhausted. I wanted to understand, she said, not bothering to lie. He walked to the desk and looked at the papers she'd spread out. And do you understand? I understand that you're caught between what's right and what's necessary. I understand that every choice you make comes with a cost. She met his eyes. I just don't know if you can live with those costs much longer. Callum sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 30 years and then some. Neither do I. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of secrets and compromises heavy between them. The attack today, Callum said finally. It wasn't random. It was retaliation for the evictions last month. I know that. Thwarting knows that. Hell, everyone knows that. And nothing. Because if I acknowledge it, if I admit that we provoked this, then I'm admitting the whole enterprise is built on violence. He laughed bitterly. Which it is, of course. I just can't say it out loud. Rowan moved to kneel in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers like she had the night before. Then maybe it's time to stop building, to find a different way. There is no different way. This is what power looks like in the territories. Brutal, unforgiving, built on blood. Then burn it down, Rowan said fiercely. All of it. The contracts, the operations, the whole damn empire. Start over. Callum looked at her like she'd lost her mind. That's insane. Is it? Or is it the only sane option left? She squeezed his hands. You said Catherine died hating you because you wouldn't change. Won't let go. What if she was right? What if this place, this legacy, is poison? It's all I have. No, Rowan said. It's not. They stared at each other, and Rowan could see him teetering on the edge of something, a choice, a change, a break with everything he'd built his life around. Then Crawford burst into the library, his face pale. Your Grace, there's been another attack. The Western mine. They're saying... He swallowed hard. They're saying they took hostages this time. Callum was on his feet instantly. Who? Workers, families, 15 people, maybe more. Crawford's voice shook. And they're demanding to speak with you, personally, at the old fort ruins by dawn. It's a trap, Rowan said immediately. Of course it's a trap. Callum was already moving, grabbing his coat. Crawford, gather 20 armed men. We leave in an hour. No. Rowan stepped in front of him. You can't go. If they want you specifically, they're planning to kill you. They have 15 hostages. I don't have a choice. Then let me go with you. Absolutely not. Callum, listen to me. She grabbed his arm. They're angry because they think you don't see them as human, that you'll sacrifice them for profit. But if you show up with an army, you prove them right. What would you have me do? Walk in unarmed? Yes, Rowan said. With me. Show them you're willing to negotiate, to listen, to see them as people, not obstacles. Callum stared at her like she'd suggested they fly to the moon. That's suicide. It's the only way to stop this cycle. She moved closer, her voice urgent. Violence met with violence just creates more violence. Someone has to break the pattern. And if we die trying? Then at least we die trying to do the right thing instead of the profitable thing. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, Callum turned to Crawford. 10 men, armed but at a distance. If this goes wrong, they get Mrs. Viront out first. Understand? Crawford looked like he wanted to argue, but simply nodded. Yes, Your Grace. After he left, Callum turned back to Rowan. If you get killed because of this idealistic nonsense, I won't, she said with more confidence than she felt. You can't know that. No, but I know staying here doing nothing, letting this spiral into a war, That's not an option either. She took his face in her hands. We face this together, like we faced the mine, like we'll face everything else. Callum pulled her close, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I don't know how to be the man you think I am. Then learn, she whispered, starting tomorrow. They rode out before dawn, just the two of them and 10 men hanging back at a careful distance. The old fort ruins sat on a plateau overlooking the valley, a crumbling reminder of earlier conflicts, earlier bloodshed. As they approached, Rowan could see figures waiting, at least 20 of them, armed with rifles and bows. And in the center, tied and kneeling, the hostages. Last chance to turn back, Callum said quietly. Not a chance. They dismounted and walked forward on foot, their hands clearly visible and empty. Rowan's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin up, her steps steady. A man stepped forward from the group, older, with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. He spoke in accented English. Callum Viront, the Iron Duke, finally come to see the people whose lives you've been destroying. I came to negotiate the release of these people, Callum said, his voice level. They're innocent. Like our families were innocent when your men burned our winter camps? The man's voice was hard as stone. Like our children were innocent when they starved because you diverted the river for your mining operations? Rowan saw Callum flinch, saw the truth of it land. I didn't know, he started. You didn't care to know, the man interrupted. As long as your profits grew, what did it matter who suffered? You're right, Callum said, and Rowan heard the shock ripple through both groups. What? You're right, Callum repeated, stronger this time. I didn't ask, didn't look, didn't want to see what my ambition was costing, and people died because of it. Your people, my people, all of us caught in a system that values land and profit over lives. The man studied him suspiciously. Pretty words from a man standing on stolen ground. They're not pretty words, they're the truth. Callum took a step forward. And if you want to kill me for it, I understand. But let these people go first. They didn't make the choices I made. Callum, Rowan started. No. He looked at her, his eyes clear and calm. This is my responsibility, my legacy, mine to answer for. The leader raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Callum's chest. Rowan's world narrowed to that single moment. The gun, Callum's steady breathing, her own heart trying to beat out of her chest. Then she stepped in front of him. Wait, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Before you pull that trigger, listen to me. I know you have no reason to trust us. I know he has done terrible things. But killing him won't bring back your families, won't restore your land. It'll just create another cycle of revenge. Get out of the way, woman, the leader said. No. Rowan stood her ground. Because if you kill him, you have to kill me too, and then those men back there will kill you, and your people will kill them. And on until everyone's dead and nothing's changed. She's right. Everyone turned. One of the hostages, a young woman with a baby clutched to her chest, had spoken. My husband works in the Duke's mine, she continued, her voice shaking but determined. He's a good man, just trying to feed our family. If you kill the Duke, the mine closes. Hundreds of families lose their income. How is that justice? The mine is on our land, the leader said, but his certainty wavered. The land belongs to whoever can hold it, another voice added, an older hostage, weathered and grizzled. That's been true since time began. We can fight over it, die over it, or we can find a way to share it. The leader's rifle lowered slightly. The Duke would never agree to that. Then ask him, Rowan said. Right here, right now. Callum? Every eye turned to him. Callum stood silent for a long moment, and Rowan could see him wrestling with something enormous, the weight of his empire, his father's legacy, everything he'd built his life around. Then he spoke. I'll deed half the Northern Territory back to you. The riverlands, the winter camps, the sacred grounds, and the operations that remain, timber, mining, you'll have equal say in how they're run, equal profit sharing. The shock was palpable. Even Rowan hadn't expected him to go that far. That would cost you millions, the leader said slowly. Yes, Callum agreed. But how much is peace worth? How much is ending this cycle worth? He looked at the hostages, then back at the leader. I can't undo what's been done, but I can stop it from continuing, if you'll let me. The silence stretched so long Rowan thought she might scream. Then slowly, the leader lowered his rifle completely. Release the hostages, he said to his men. Relief flooded through Rowan so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. Callum's hand found hers, gripping tight, but as the hostages were being untied, one of the leader's men, younger, angrier, stepped forward. No, he said. This is a trick. He's lying to save himself. Makya, stand down, the leader ordered. I won't. Makya's rifle came up, pointing at Callum. He's just like his father, just like all of them. They take and take until there's nothing left, and then they offer scraps and call it generosity. Makya. The rifle fired. Time seemed to slow. Rowan saw the flash, heard Callum's sharp intake of breath, felt him stumble against her. Then chaos erupted. The men Callum had brought charged forward. Return fire echoed off the ruins. People screamed. Rowan grabbed Callum as he fell, her hands immediately going to the wound in his side. Blood, too much blood, poured between her fingers. No, 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 she chanted, pressing down hard. Callum, stay with me! Stay with me! His eyes were glazed with shock and pain. Rowan, don't talk, save your strength. She looked up wildly. Someone help! He's been shot! Crawford was there suddenly, along with two other men. They lifted Callum bodily, carrying him toward the horses. The hostages, Callum gasped. Make sure they're safe, Your Grace, Crawford assured him. All of them. Now stop talking and let us save your life. They rode back to the manor at a breakneck pace. Rowan pressed against Callum's side, keeping pressure on the wound. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his face growing paler with each passing mile. You're going to be fine, she told him fiercely. You hear me? You're going to be fine. You don't get to make a grand gesture and then die. That's not how this works. His eyes opened briefly, finding hers. Catherine, he mumbled. I'm not Catherine, Rowan said, her voice breaking. I'm Rowan, your wife, and I'm not letting you go. But even as she said it, she could feel his life bleeding out between her fingers, and she wondered if some tragedies were simply destined to repeat, no matter how hard you fought against them. They carried Callum into the manor on a makeshift stretcher, his blood staining the white sheets Mrs. Brennan had hastily provided. Rowan ran beside them, her hand still pressed to the wound, her clothes soaked crimson. The doctor! She gasped as they burst through the front doors. Someone get the doctor! He's 2 hours away, Mrs. Brennan said, her face ashen. Crawford's already sent riders, but 2 hours? Rowan's voice cracked. He doesn't have 2 hours. They carried him to his bedroom, the first time Rowan had been inside it, and laid him on the bed. The moment they stepped back, blood bloomed across the sheets like a terrible flower. Pressure, Rowan ordered, her nursing instincts from helping with births and injuries on her family's estate kicking in. Someone get me clean cloth, boiling water, and whiskey, now! The household erupted into controlled chaos. Mrs. Brennan barked orders, servants ran, and Rowan stripped away Callum's blood-soaked shirt with shaking hands. The wound was bad, a ragged hole just below his ribs, still bleeding heavily. But the bullet had gone through. That was something. If it had lodged inside, punctured something vital, she forced the thought away and focused on what she could control. Callum, she said, leaning close to his face. Can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Catherine? The name hit her like a slap, but she pushed past it. No, it's Rowan. You're hurt, but you're going to be fine. Do you understand? You're going to be fine. Liar, he mumbled, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. You're a terrible liar. Then I'll have to get better at it. She pressed clean cloth against the wound, making him gasp. Because you're not dying, I forbid it. Forbid? His eyes drifted closed. Didn't know. You could do that. I'm your wife. I can do whatever I want. His hand found hers, weak but insistent. Rowan, if I don't, you will. If I don't, he continued stubbornly. The estate, the operations. They'll try to take them. Thwarting, the council, you have to... He coughed, and fresh blood appeared on his lips. Stop talking, Rowan ordered, her voice breaking. Just stop. I don't care about the estate or the operations or any of it. I just need you to stay alive. His eyes opened one more time, clearer now, focused on her face. Why? The question hung between them, raw and honest. Because, Rowan said, tears streaming down her face, I choose you, not the arrangement, not the contract. You. And I'm not ready to let go yet. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or wonder. His hand tightened on hers. Then his eyes closed, and he went terribly still. No, Rowan whispered. No, no, no. Callum. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat. There. Faint, but there. Mrs. Brennan appeared with boiling water and a bottle of whiskey. What do you need, ma'am? Rowan looked at the housekeeper, then at Callum's unconscious form, then at her own blood-covered hands. She'd helped birth calves and foals, had cleaned wounds on horses and dogs. But this was different. This was Callum, and if she failed, she couldn't fail. I need you to hold him down, Rowan said, her voice steadier than she felt. This is going to hurt like hell, and even unconscious, he's going to fight. Mrs. Brennan called in two of the stronger male servants. Together, they held Callum's arms and legs while Rowan poured whiskey directly into the wound. Callum's entire body convulsed, a strangled scream tearing from his throat. But he didn't wake, and the whiskey did its work, cleaning out the worst of the debris. Rowan worked with hands that didn't shake, even though inside she was screaming. She packed the wound front and back with clean cloth, wrapped his torso tightly to slow the bleeding. Did everything she'd ever learned from watching doctors tend to injured workers, from reading medical texts in her father's library, from pure, desperate instinct. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. She sent the servants away and pulled a chair beside the bed. Callum's breathing was shallow, his face gray. But he was breathing. That had to be enough. Hours passed. Rowan held his hand and talked to him, telling him stories about her childhood, about Tempest, about the first time she jumped a fence that everyone said was too high for her. I did it anyway, she said, her voice hoarse from talking. Because that's what we do, isn't it? The impossible things, the terrifying things. We do them because the alternative is giving up, and neither of us knows how to do that. Dawn was breaking when Crawford appeared in the doorway. The doctor's here, ma'am. Rowan's relief was so intense she nearly collapsed. Send him up, immediately. Doctor. Morrison was an older man with gentle hands and sharp eyes. He examined Callum thoroughly while Rowan hovered, answering questions about the injury, the timeline, what she'd done. When he finished, he turned to her with an expression she couldn't read. Mrs. Viront, you saved his life. The words didn't register at first. What? The wound was serious, but you kept him from bleeding out. The whiskey prevented infection from setting in immediately. The packing stopped the hemorrhaging. He shook his head slowly. If you'd waited for me to arrive, he'd be dead. No question. Rowan felt her legs give out. She sat down hard in the chair, her entire body starting to shake as the adrenaline finally drained away. He's going to live? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. If he survives the next 24 hours without fever, yes. He's strong, and he's got something to live for. Dr. Morrison looked at her with something like respect. Where did you learn field medicine? I didn't. I just did what seemed necessary. Well, you did it correctly. Better than some trained surgeons I've seen. He packed his bag. Keep him still. Change the dressings twice daily. If fever sets in, send for me immediately. Otherwise, I'll return in 3 days. After he left, Rowan sat beside Callum's bed and finally let herself cry, great shuddering sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She'd almost lost him, had felt his life bleeding out under her hands, had stared into the abyss of a future without him and found it unbearable. When had that happened? When had this forced marriage become something real? She didn't know, couldn't pinpoint a moment, but sitting there in the gray dawn light, holding the hand of a man who might still die, she knew with absolute certainty that she loved him. Not the idea of him, not the arrangement, but him, difficult, damaged, impossible Callum Viront. You'd better wake up, she told his unconscious form, because we have things to discuss. Important things. And you're not allowed to die before I tell you that I... She stopped, the words catching in her throat, but they needed to be said, even if he couldn't hear them. I love you, she whispered. I love you, you stubborn, infuriating man, so you have to live, because I'm not doing this without you. The day passed in a blur of changing bandages, monitoring his breathing, forcing water between his lips drop by drop. Mrs. Brennan brought food that Rowan couldn't eat. Crawford brought updates about the estate that she couldn't process. All that mattered was the rise and fall of Callum's chest. As evening approached, visitors began to arrive. First was Pike, hat in hand, his weathered face creased with worry. Just wanted to check on the Duke, ma'am. The men are asking. He's stable, Rowan said. Tell them he's going to be fine. Yes, ma'am. And ma'am? Pike hesitated. What you did this morning, at the ruins. Standing in front of that gun. That took more courage than most men I know have. It wasn't courage. It was necessity. Same thing sometimes. He nodded respectfully and left. Then came the council members, not Thwarting, thankfully, but the others. They gathered in the hallway outside Callum's room, speaking in low, urgent voices about operations, contracts, decisions that needed to be made. Rowan emerged from the bedroom and faced them. Gentlemen, she said quietly, I understand you have concerns, but they'll have to wait. My husband is unconscious and fighting for his life. Business can wait. Mrs. Viront, one of them, Harrison, said carefully, we sympathize with your situation, but there are time-sensitive matters, which will still be there tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever the Duke is well enough to address them. Her voice hardened. Unless you're suggesting you'd like to make decisions without him? The implication hung in the air. Were they vultures circling a dying man's empire? Harrison had the grace to look ashamed. Of course not. We'll wait for word from the Duke. Good. Then I suggest you go home to your families and stop hovering like death itself is waiting in the wings. They left, chastened. Mrs. Brennan appeared as soon as they were gone, a tray in her hands. You need to eat, ma'am, and rest. I can watch him for a few hours. I can't. You can, and you will. You're no good to him if you collapse. The housekeeper's voice softened. He'd want you to take care of yourself. Rowan knew she was right. Reluctantly, she ate a few bites of bread and cheese, then stretched out on the settee near the bed, intending to rest for just a few minutes. She woke to someone calling her name. Rowan. The voice was rough, barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. She bolted upright to find Callum's eyes open, looking at her with confusion and pain, but blessedly, miraculously conscious. You're awake, she breathed, moving to his bedside. She caught herself. You're awake. Apparently, he tried to move and gasped. What happened? You were shot. At the ruins. Do you remember? His brow furrowed. The hostages, did they... Everyone's safe. The hostages are men, even most of the raiders. Rowan carefully took his hand. You almost died, Callum. The doctor said if I hadn't stopped the bleeding, you saved me. It wasn't a question. Someone had to. You were being heroically stupid. His laugh turned into a cough that made him wince. Heroically stupid. That should be on my tombstone. Don't joke about that. Her voice cracked. You almost got one. Callum's expression sobered. He studied her face, tear-stained, exhausted, fierce. You look terrible. You look worse. I believe it. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. How long was I out? Almost 30 hours. And you stayed the whole time. Where else would I be? Something shifted in his eyes, understanding maybe, or realization. You meant it. What you said at the ruins about choosing me. Rowan's heart hammered. Had he heard? She'd thought he was unconscious. Every word, she said quietly. They looked at each other for a long moment, years of distance and damage falling away like dead leaves. I don't deserve you, Callum said finally. Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway. Rowan, and before you start with the noble self-sacrificing nonsense, save it. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not Catherine, scared of this place and this life. I'm not your mother telling you to give everything up. I'm me, and I choose this. I choose you, even when you're being impossible. Especially then. Especially then. Callum's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. I don't know how to be what you need. Then we'll figure it out together. She leaned down carefully, mindful of his injury, and pressed her forehead to his. That's what partners do, isn't it? They figure things out. Partners, he repeated, testing the word. Not just a business arrangement. Never just that. Not for me. His hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite his weakness. I was so afraid. Of repeating the past. Of hurting you like I hurt Catherine. Stop, Rowan said firmly. The past is done. Catherine's tragedy was her own. And yours. But it doesn't have to be mine. We write our own story from here. And what story would that be? One where two stubborn people choose each other every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She smiled. Think you can manage that? With you? Callum smiled back, genuine and warm. I can try. Over the next week, as Callum slowly recovered, the world beyond the manor began to shift. Word of what had happened at the ruins spread like wildfire. The Iron Duke, shot while trying to negotiate peace. His wife standing between him and a rifle. The promise of shared land and shared profits. Some called it weakness. Thwarting, predictably, tried to rally the other council members against it, claiming Callum had been compromised by sentiment. But others, the workers, the families, the people who'd lost loved ones to the endless cycle of violence, saw it differently. They saw hope. 2 days after Callum woke, a delegation arrived from the Northern Territories. Not raiders or warriors, but elders, leaders, people ready to talk. Rowan met them at the door, Callum still too weak to stand for long periods. We've come to speak with the Duke, their spokesman said, the same older man who'd led the confrontation at the ruins. He's recovering, Rowan replied. But I can speak for him in the meantime. My name is Rowan Viront. We know who you are, the man said. You're the woman who stood in front of a rifle for him. I'm also the woman who told Thwarting his plans for displacing your people were unconscionable. She met his gaze steadily. And I'm the woman who will hold my husband to his promise. The land will be returned. The profit sharing will happen. On that, you have my word. The elder studied her for a long moment. Your word means something? It means everything. He nodded slowly. Then we will trust it. For now. But we will be watching. As you should be. They talked for hours, working out preliminary details. Which lands would be returned, how the profit sharing would be structured, what oversight would look like. It was complex, messy, and fraught with potential pitfalls. But it was also progress. When they finally left, Rowan found Callum standing at the top of the stairs, leaning heavily on the banister, but standing nonetheless. You should be in bed, she scolded, hurrying to support him. I wanted to see. He looked at her with something like awe. You negotiated with them, set terms, gave them assurances in my name. Was I wrong to? No. He shook his head. You were perfect. They trust you more than they'd ever trust me. Then use that. Let me be the bridge between your world and theirs. She helped him back toward the bedroom. That's what partners do, right? Use their different strengths? When did you become so wise? Somewhere between crawling into a collapsing mine shaft and performing field surgery on my husband. She smiled. I've had a busy month. Callum laughed, then winced. Don't make me laugh, it hurts. Good. Maybe it'll teach you not to get shot. As his recovery progressed, word came that Thwarting had called an emergency council meeting, without Callum's knowledge or consent. He's trying to orchestrate a coup, Crawford reported grimly, claiming you're incapacitated and unfit to run the operations. Callum, still pale but growing stronger daily, started to rise from bed. Then I'll attend and… No. Rowan put a hand on his chest, pushing him back down. You're not ready. The doctor said another week of bed rest minimum. I can't let Thwarting… You won't. I will. Both Callum and Crawford stared at her. You? Crawford said carefully. Ma'am, With all respect, the council has never allowed a woman to, The council has never had a choice before. Rowan was already moving to her wardrobe, pulling out her most severe, businesslike dress. I'm the Duke's wife. In his absence, I speak with his authority. Unless someone wants to argue that point. Callum's smile was fierce and proud. I wouldn't dare. An hour later, Rowan walked into the council chamber where 6 men sat around a table, Thwarting at the head looking smug and satisfied. His expression curdled when he saw her. Mrs. Viront, he said with false politeness. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. This is a private council meeting, which you called without the Duke's knowledge or authorization. Rowan took the seat at the opposite end of the table, Callum's seat. That sounds less like a council meeting and more like a conspiracy. Shocked silence. Now see here, Harrison blustered. We're simply concerned about the direction of the operations given the Duke's condition. The Duke's condition is improving daily. He'll be back to full capacity within the month. Rowan folded her hands on the table. But in the meantime, I'm here to represent his interests. So please, Thwarting, share with everyone what you were planning to propose in his absence. Thornton's jaw tightened. I was merely going to suggest that given the Duke's recent lapse in judgment regarding the Northern Territories, perhaps the Council should assume greater oversight of operations. You mean stage a coup? I mean ensure business continuity. By seizing control of assets that don't belong to you? Rowan's voice was ice. Let me be very clear, gentlemen. My husband made a promise at the ruins. That promise will be kept. The land will be returned. The profit sharing will be implemented. And anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to divest their interests and leave. You can't make that decision, Thwarting said, his face reddening. Can't I? I'm the Duke's wife, his legal representative in matters of estate. And unless someone here wants to challenge that in court, which would take months and cost fortunes, I absolutely can make that decision. She leaned forward. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to your businesses and let my husband recover. And when he's ready, we'll have a proper council meeting where we discuss the new direction of these operations. Together. As partners. Not as predators circling a wounded man. She stood, signaling the meeting was over. Mrs. Viront? Harrison said carefully. What happened at the ruins, the Duke getting shot? Some are saying it was your fault. That your interference provoked the attack. Rowan turned to face him fully. And what do you say? Harrison met her gaze, and she saw him make a choice. I say your husband would be dead if you hadn't been there. And I say the people who've been working these territories for 20 years couldn't broker the peace you managed in a single morning. He stood. For what it's worth, you have my support, and my vote against whatever power grab Thornton's attempting. One by one, the other council members stood, all except Thwarting, and voiced their agreement. It seems, Rowan said pleasantly, you're outvoted, Thwarting. Democracy is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Thornton's face was purple with rage. This isn't over. No, Rowan agreed. It's not. But the days of you manipulating my husband's empire for your own profit, those are done. She walked out of the council chamber with her head high, her hands steady, and her heart pounding like thunder. Crawford was waiting outside. He seemed at a loss for words. That was masterful, ma'am. That was necessary. She paused. Make sure someone keeps an eye on Thwarting. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. Already arranged. When Rowan returned to the manor, she found Callum out of bed again, this time sitting in his study, reviewing papers. You're supposed to be resting, she said. I was. Then I got bored. He looked up, his eyes bright. How did it go? Thwarting tried to stage a coup. I shut it down. You're welcome. Callum's laugh was full and genuine. You shut down a coup in your first solo council meeting. It wasn't that hard. Turns out most of them were just scared and looking for leadership. I gave them some. You're extraordinary, you know that? Rowan crossed to him, perching on the edge of his desk. I'm learning that about myself, yes. He pulled her down into his lap carefully, mindful of his healing wound. When I asked you to marry me, you didn't ask. You purchased. When I purchased you, he corrected, smiling. I thought I was getting a transaction, an arrangement, a means to an end. And now? Now I know I got the best thing that's ever happened to me. His arms tightened around her. You saved my life, Rowan, twice. Once on that table when you kept me from bleeding out, and once before that when you made me see that the empire I'd built wasn't worth the cost it was demanding. We saved each other, Rowan said softly. That's what partners do. Partners, Callum repeated, pressing his forehead to hers. I like the sound of that. They sat together in the quiet study, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and for the first time since Rowan had arrived at Viront Manor, it felt like home. Not a prison, not a cage, but home. A week later, as spring began to break across the mountains, the documents were drawn up. Half the Northern Territory officially returned to its original inhabitants. Profit-sharing agreements signed and sealed. A new council formed, one that included representatives from the settlements, not just the business interests. It was revolutionary. It was terrifying. It was exactly what needed to happen. On the day the papers were signed, Rowan and Callum stood on the manor's front steps, watching the delegation from the Northern Territories depart. This changes everything, Callum said quietly. Yes, Rowan agreed. It does. Other landowners will call me weak, a traitor to my class. Let them. He looked at her, a smile playing at his lips. You're not worried? About what other people think? Not even a little. She took his hand. We're building something new here, Callum. Something better. And if they can't see that, it's their loss. When did you become so fearless? The day I married you and decided I wasn't going to let anyone, including you, make me small. She squeezed his hand. We're partners now. Equals. And together, we're unstoppable. Callum pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. I love you, Rowan Viront. It was the first time he'd said it out loud. The words hung between them, precious and perfect. I love you too, she whispered against his lips, even when you're impossible. Especially then? Especially then. They stood together on the steps of their fortress, watching the sun set over mountains that were finally, tentatively, at peace. The empire Callum had built on blood and ambition was being transformed into something sustainable, something just. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, resistance, failures, but they would face it together, two stubborn, impossible people who had chosen each other against all odds. And in that choice, they had found something stronger than any empire, a partnership built on trust, respect, and earned love. The Iron Duke and his defiant bride, rewriting the rules and refusing to apologize for it. Summer arrived like a promise kept. The mountains that had seemed so brutal and unforgiving when Rowan first arrived now bloomed with wildflowers. The forests rang with birdsong, and Viront Manor, once silent and cold as a tomb, had begun to feel alive. Rowan stood at her bedroom window watching workers rebuild the damaged mine entrance, their voices carrying across the valley in a language that mixed English with the indigenous tongue of the northern settlements. Integration, slow and imperfect, but real. Behind her, Callum emerged from the bathing room, moving with only a slight stiffness where the bullet had torn through him 3 months ago. You're up early, he said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. Couldn't sleep. She leaned back against him, savoring the warmth of his body. I keep thinking about the Harvest Council meeting today. Nervous? Should I be? Callum pressed a kiss to her temple. You faced down armed raiders in a coup attempt. I think you can handle a few landowners arguing about grain distribution. It's not the landowners I'm worried about. It's Thwarting. Rowan turned in his arms to face him. He's been too quiet lately. That man doesn't accept defeat gracefully. No, Callum agreed. But he also doesn't have the allies he used to. Harrison's firmly in our camp now. So are most of the others. Thwarting's influence is waning, which makes him dangerous, which makes him desperate. Callum's expression hardened. Crawford's been watching him. If he tries anything, we'll handle it. Together. Together, Callum echoed, smiling. I'm still getting used to that word. The Harvest Council meeting was held in the Great Hall. A massive room Rowan had had cleaned and repurposed specifically for gatherings that included both the business interests and the settlement representatives. No more backroom deals or exclusive meetings. Everything out in the open. 50 people filled the space. Landowners, miners, timber workers, settlement elders, merchants. A cross-section of the entire territory gathered to discuss how to manage the autumn harvest and winter preparations fairly. Rowan sat at the head table beside Callum, with Harrison on her other side. Across from them sat the northern settlement leaders, including the elder who'd held a rifle on Callum at the ruins. His name, she'd learned, was Silverhawk. And beneath his stern exterior was a pragmatic man who understood that survival required cooperation. Thwarting sat at the far end of the room, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt. "Let's begin," Rowan said, calling the meeting to order. First item, water rights for the eastern fields. What followed was 3 hours of intense negotiation. Who got access to the river during drought season? How much timber could be harvested without devastating the forest? Fair wages for miners versus sustainable profit margins. It was exhausting, contentious work. But it was also democracy in action, and Rowan found herself energized by it. Until Thwarting stood. "I have a concern," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "One that I believe needs to be addressed before we continue." Rowan felt Callum tense beside her. "What concern would that be, Thwarting?" "The validity of this entire council." Thornton's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Specifically, whether Mrs. Viront has the legal authority to be conducting these meetings at all." The room went silent. "Explain," Callum said, his voice dangerous. "Well, it's quite simple, really." Thwarting pulled out a document from his coat. "I've had my lawyers review the marriage contract between you and Miss Ashford. Excuse me, Mrs. Viront. And according to the original terms, she was brought here to provide an heir. Nothing more. She has no legal standing in business matters, no authority to negotiate on behalf of the estate, and yet here she sits, making decisions that affect thousands of people and millions in assets." Rowan's heart hammered, but she kept her face impassive. "The Duke gave me that authority." "Did he? In writing? With proper legal documentation?" Thornton's smile widened. "Or has everyone simply accepted it because it was convenient? Because the Duke was incapacitated and someone needed to make decisions?" "This is ridiculous," Harrison interjected. "Mrs. Viront has been acting with the Duke's full knowledge and consent." "Consent given while recovering from a near-fatal injury," Thwarting interrupted. "Some might argue he wasn't in his right mind. Some might even argue that Mrs. Viront took advantage of his vulnerability to seize power she was never intended to have." "That's a lie," Rowan said, her voice cold. "Is it? Then show me the legal documents granting you authority. Show me where, in this marriage contract your family signed, it says you have any role beyond producing children." Thwarting looked around the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been operating under the assumption that Mrs. Viront speaks for the Duke. But what if she's been acting in her own interests all along? What if these agreements with the settlements, agreements that cost us territory and profits, were never what the Duke wanted?" Rowan felt the room shifting, doubt creeping in like fog. Even some of the settlement representatives were looking at her with uncertainty. "Callum," she said quietly, "you need to—" "No." Callum stood, his voice ringing across the hall. "Thwarting wants documentation? Fine. Mrs. Brennan?" The housekeeper appeared from a side door, carrying a leather folder. "What you're about to see," Callum said, taking the folder, "was drafted 6 weeks ago and witnessed by Dr. Morrison, Crawford, and 3 other independent parties. I wanted to wait for the right moment to make it public. It seems Thornton's forced my hand." He opened the folder and held up a document for all to see. "This is a deed of co-ownership," he announced. "As of 6 weeks ago, Rowan Viront is not just my wife. She is the legal co-owner of every asset, every operation, every acre of land in my possession. She has equal authority, equal decision-making power, equal legal standing in all business matters." The shock in the room was palpable. "Furthermore," Callum continued, his eyes fixed on Thwarting, "in the event of my death or incapacitation, she assumes sole ownership and control, not the council, not business partners, her, because she's proven herself capable, trustworthy, and far better at this job than I ever was. Rowan stared at him, tears burning in her eyes. He hadn't told her, hadn't even hinted that he'd done this. "This is insanity," Thwarting sputtered. "You can't just—" "I can, and I did." Callum's smile was cold. "And if you have a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with my lawyers, who are substantially better than yours, I might add." He sat down, sliding the deed across the table to Rowan. "I was going to tell you tonight, over dinner, but Thornton's dramatic timing made a better reveal." Rowan looked at the document, her hand shaking. "Callum, this is long overdue." He took her hand under the table, squeezing gently. "You've earned it 100 times over. This just makes it official." Silverhawk stood slowly, and the room's attention shifted to him. "The Duke honors his partner with truth and power. This is good. This is the way it should be." He looked at Thornton. "You speak of legal authority. The Duke has provided it. Unless you wish to challenge him in combat, I suggest you accept his decision." A ripple of laughter went through the settlement representatives. Challenging the Duke to combat was clearly a joke, but the message was clear. They supported Rowan's authority. Thornton's face went purple. "This is a mockery of proper business practice. This meeting is adjourned," Rowan said, finding her voice. "We'll reconvene tomorrow, once everyone's had time to review the ownership documents. Thornton, if you wish to divest your interests and leave the council, you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, you'll accord me the respect my position demands." She stood, and the entire room stood with her, settlement leaders and business interests alike showing unified support. Thornton stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The moment he was gone, the room erupted in conversation. Harrison crossed to Rowan and Callum, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "Well, that was quite a show," he said. "Though I have to say, watching Thornton's face when you produced that deed was worth the price of admission." "He won't let this go," Rowan warned. "Probably not, but he's also running out of allies and options." Harrison glanced at the settlement representatives, many of whom were clustered around Silverhawk, discussing the development. "You've built something remarkable here. A partnership between peoples who've been at war for decades. That's not easy to tear down." After the meeting dispersed, Rowan and Callum walked back to the manor in silence. When they reached his study, she finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" Callum moved to pour them both whiskey. "Because I wanted it to be a surprise, and because I knew you'd argue about it." "Damn right I would have argued about it. Callum, signing over half your empire—" "Our empire," he corrected, handing her a glass. "And I didn't sign over half. I acknowledged what was already true, that we built this together, that you have as much right to it as I do. But your mother, the legacy your father, would be ashamed of what I'd become before you arrived." Callum took a drink, his eyes distant. "My father built this empire on ambition and ruthlessness. It cost him his life and nearly cost me my soul. You showed me a different way, a better way. You think I'm going to keep all that power and authority for myself after you've done the work of transforming it?" Rowan set down her glass and crossed to him, framing his face with her hands. "You're an impossible man, Callum Viront." "So you keep telling me." He smiled. "Is that why you love me?" "It's one of the reasons." She kissed him softly. "Thank you for trusting me with this, for seeing me as an equal when the whole world said I should be nothing but decoration. You were never decoration, Rowan. You were always fire." His arms tightened around her. "And I'm just grateful I didn't get burned." "Oh, you definitely got burned. You're just too stubborn to admit it." His laugh rumbled through his chest, warm and genuine. "Fair point." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, two people who'd started as strangers and become something far more powerful, true partners. But their peace was short-lived. 3 days later, Rowan woke to shouting in the courtyard. She threw on a robe and ran downstairs to find Crawford and a dozen workers gathered around a burned effigy hanging from the manor gates. The effigy was crude but unmistakable. A woman in a dress with dark hair and a sign around its neck that read, "Witch." "When did this appear?" Callum demanded, having arrived seconds behind Rowan. "Sometime before dawn, Your Grace. The night watch didn't see anyone." Rowan stared at the effigy, her stomach churning. This wasn't just an insult, it was a threat. "Thornton," she said quietly. "We don't know that," Crawford cautioned. "Don't we? Rowan turned to face the gathered workers. A woman challenges the old order, demands equality and justice, and suddenly she's a witch. It's the oldest play in the book. Cut it down, Callum ordered, and double the watch. If anyone comes near this property. No, Rowan interrupted. Everyone stared at her. Leave it up, she said firmly. I want everyone to see it. I want them to know exactly what we're dealing with. Rowan, that's not... It's necessary. She met Callum's eyes. They're trying to intimidate me, to make me afraid. If we take it down and hide it, we're admitting it worked. But if we leave it up and I keep doing my job, we show them I'm not afraid. Silverhawk appeared at the gates, having arrived early for a scheduled meeting. He took in the effigy with a single, contemptuous glance. They fear what they cannot control, he said. This is good. Fear means you are winning. It doesn't feel like winning, Rowan admitted. The first woman chief of my people faced worse. They called her demon, said she brought sickness and bad luck. She wore their hatred like armor. He looked at Rowan with something like respect. You will do the same. Over the next weeks, more incidents followed. Supplies went missing from the manor. Workers reported being harassed in town. Someone started a rumor that Rowan had used feminine wiles to bewitch the Duke into signing over his empire. But for every attack, there was also support. Settlement women began showing up at the manor, offering to help with work. Miners' wives sent food. Even some of the businessmen's wives, tired of being treated as decorative objects themselves, reached out quietly to offer solidarity. You're becoming a symbol, Mrs. Brennan observed one evening, helping Rowan sort through letters of support. Whether you wanted to be or not. I never wanted to be a symbol, Rowan said tiredly. I just wanted to be treated like a person. Same thing sometimes. The crisis came to a head in late autumn. The harvest had been good, excellent even, thanks to the cooperative planning and fair distribution of resources. Everyone should have been celebrating. Instead, Thwarting called an emergency gathering of all the major landowners, merchants, and business interests in the territory, and he didn't invite Rowan or the settlement representatives. It's a direct challenge, Harrison warned, having gotten word of the meeting and immediately ridden to the manor. He's trying to form a coalition against you, against the new way of doing things. Then I'll attend anyway, Rowan said. Rowan, if you show up uninvited, then I'll be making a statement. She was already dressing in her most severe business attire. That I don't need an invitation to participate in decisions that affect my territory. Our territory, Callum corrected, fastening his own coat. And we're both going. The meeting was held in the town's largest hall, packed with 50 of the most powerful people in the territory. Thwarting stood at the front, already mid-speech when Rowan and Callum walked in. Cannot continue to allow sentiment to dictate business decisions, he was saying. The territory needs strong leadership, not... He stopped abruptly when he saw them. Please, continue, Rowan said pleasantly, walking down the center aisle. You were talking about strong leadership. I'm fascinated to hear your definition. This is a private meeting, Thwarting said coldly. Is it? Because I count at least 20 people here whose operations are on land I co-own, which makes their business my business. She reached the front and turned to face the crowd. So by all means, Thwarting, finish your speech. Tell everyone what you really think. Thornton's jaw clenched. Fine. I'll speak plainly. This territory is being destroyed by naive idealism, giving land back to savages, sharing profits with workers who've done nothing to earn them, allowing a woman, he said the word like it was poison, to make decisions she has no experience or authority to make. I have both experience and authority, Rowan replied. Legal authority, granted by my husband, and experience earned through months of negotiations, conflict resolution, and actual results. Or did you miss the part where our harvest yields are up 30% and violent incidents are down 60%? Coincidence, Thwarting scoffed. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, the only thing threatening our prosperity is you. You, who profits from conflict. You, who loses money every time we find peaceful solutions instead of violent ones. Rowan stepped closer. Tell me, Thwarting, how much did you make last year selling weapons to both sides of the territorial conflicts? The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Thwarton's face went white. That's a lie. Is it? Callum spoke for the first time, his voice cutting through the noise. Because I have receipts, sales records, invoices, all showing that you've been arming both the settlers and the raiders, ensuring the conflict continued so you could profit from both sides. He pulled documents from his coat and held them up. Crawford's been investigating for months. We have proof of everything. You... Thwarting lunged forward, but two men from the crowd grabbed him. Let me go. This is entrapment. Slander. It's business records, Rowan said coldly. Your business records. And unless you want them distributed to every newspaper from here to the coast, you'll sit down and shut up. Thwarting struggled for another moment, then went still, his eyes burning with hate. Here's what's going to happen, Rowan continued, addressing the crowd. Thwarting is hereby removed from all councils and partnerships. His interests in the territory will be bought out at fair market value, and he will leave. Permanently. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave with him. She paused, looking around the room. But if you stay under the new rules. Fair profit sharing, sustainable practices, cooperation instead of exploitation. And yes, that includes accepting that a woman can run a business empire just as well as any man. Silence stretched across the hall. Then slowly, Harrison stood. I vote to accept the new terms and to officially recognize Mrs. Viront's full authority and partnership. One by one, others stood. Landowners, merchants, business leaders, not everyone, some sat stubbornly, unwilling to adapt. But enough. More than enough. Motion carries, Rowan said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. Meeting adjourned. Except you, Thwarting. You stay. We need to discuss the terms of your departure. After everyone else filed out, Thwarting remained in his chair, looking smaller somehow, diminished. You've destroyed me, he said quietly. No, Rowan replied. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone knew about it. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Callum moved to stand beside Rowan. You're done here, Thwarting. Accept it with grace, or we release those documents publicly, and you're done everywhere. Thwarting stood slowly, his face twisted with bitterness. You think you've won. But this, he gestured at Rowan, this experiment of yours, it'll fail. Because people don't change. They don't want equality. They want someone to tell them who to hate and who to blame. And when it all falls apart, I'll be there to remind everyone that I was right. Then I guess we'll see, Rowan said. Crawford will escort you out. After he left, Rowan and Callum stood alone in the empty hall. Did that really just happen? Rowan asked, her legs suddenly shaky. It did. Callum pulled her close. You just won, Rowan, completely and decisively. We won, she corrected. Together. Together, he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Always. Winter arrived with the first snow in November. Rowan stood at her bedroom window, their bedroom now, as she'd finally moved her things into Callum's room permanently, watching the white blanket transform the harsh landscape into something beautiful. She felt different than she had a year ago, stronger, surer, like she'd finally grown into the skin she was meant to inhabit. Behind her, Callum emerged from the bathing room and stopped, staring at her. What? She asked, seeing his expression. Nothing. It's just... He crossed to her, turning her to face him fully. You're showing. Rowan looked down at herself and realized he was right. The slight swell of her abdomen was finally visible beneath her nightgown. She'd known for 2 months. Had been waiting for the right moment to tell him, terrified of what his reaction might be after what happened with Catherine. I was going to tell you, she said quietly. I just wasn't sure how. Callum's hand moved to her stomach, trembling slightly. How far along? 4 months, maybe a little more. The doctor says early spring. His eyes were bright with tears. A baby. Are you... Rowan's voice caught. Are you afraid? Terrified, he admitted, but also... He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Also happier than I have any right to be. You're going to have my child, Rowan. Our child. Something I thought I'd never have again. I'm strong, she said firmly. Stronger than Catherine. I won't... I know. He pulled back to look at her. I know you won't. Because you're you. And because this time, I'm not asking you to do this. I'm not pressuring or demanding. If you're scared, if you want... I want this baby, Rowan interrupted. I want this life. I want everything we're building together, even knowing it's hard, even knowing it's dangerous. I choose it. I choose us. Callum kissed her then, deep and desperate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both were crying. I love you, he said. So much it terrifies me. Good, Rowan replied, smiling through her tears. Being terrified means you have something to lose, something worth fighting for. Everything worth fighting for. The pregnancy was not easy. Rowan was sick for months. Then came the exhaustion, the aches, the fears that kept her up at night. But through it all, Callum was there, holding her hair when she was sick, rubbing her swollen feet, reading to her when she couldn't sleep. And the territory rallied around them. Settlement women brought traditional remedies. The miners' wives organized a rotation to help with household tasks. Even Harrison's wife, previously distant and proper, showed up one day with hand-knitted baby clothes. The whole territory is holding its breath, Mrs. Brennan observed one evening, waiting to see if this works. If you survive. I will, Rowan said with more confidence than she felt. I believe you, the housekeeper replied. But others remember Catherine. Remember what happened last time. I'm not her. No, you're not. But they're still afraid. The Duke's afraid. Even if he won't say it. Rowan knew it was true. She could see the fear in Callum's eyes every time she winced or stumbled. Could feel him watching her constantly, terrified that history would repeat itself. The crisis she'd been dreading came in late February. Labor started early, 3 weeks before the doctor had predicted. Rowan woke in the middle of the night to pain lancing through her abdomen and her water breaking in a warm rush. Callum, she gasped, shaking him awake. It's time. He was up instantly, calling for Mrs. Brennan, sending riders for the doctor, organizing the household into controlled chaos. But as the hours stretched on and the pain intensified, the doctor still hadn't arrived. A late winter storm had blocked the roads, making travel impossible. We can't wait, Rowan said through gritted teeth as another contraction racked her body. The baby's coming now. Mrs. Brennan looked terrified. Ma'am, I've never... Then learn, Rowan snapped, because I'm not doing this alone. 2 settlement women arrived, summoned by Crawford, who'd had the foresight to send for them when the doctor's delay became clear. They'd delivered dozens of babies in their community and knew what to do. They took charge immediately, barking orders at Mrs. Brennan, preparing the room, examining Rowan with experienced hands. Baby is coming fast, one of them said in broken English. You push when we say, yes? Yes, Rowan agreed, beyond caring about pride or propriety. Callum hovered near the door, his face white with terror. Should I leave? Don't you dare, Rowan said fiercely. If I'm doing this, you're watching. Rowan! Get over here and hold my hand now. He did, and Rowan gripped his hand so hard she felt bones grind. The pain was indescribable, worse than anything she'd ever experienced. She screamed, cursed, threatened to kill everyone in the room. And through it all, Callum stayed, whispering encouragement, wiping sweat from her face, telling her she was strong, she was brave, she could do this. Hours blurred together, the storm raged outside, and inside Rowan fought the hardest battle of her life. Finally, as dawn broke, one of the settlement women shouted, I see head! One more push! Rowan bore down with everything she had, and suddenly the pressure released. A baby's cry filled the room, high, indignant, beautiful. A girl, the settlement woman announced, placing the squalling infant on Rowan's chest. A healthy, strong girl. Rowan looked down at her daughter, red-faced, furious at being born, absolutely perfect, and burst into tears. We did it, she sobbed. Callum, look! We did it! Callum was crying too, his hand gentle on the baby's tiny head. She's beautiful. She's perfect. You're perfect. The settlement women finished their work with quiet efficiency, making sure Rowan was stable, that the bleeding was normal, that everything was as it should be. You are very strong, one of them told Rowan, like mountain woman, not like soft city lady. Thank you, Rowan said, meaning it with her whole heart. Thank you for being here, for helping me. We are all one people now, the woman replied simply. This baby, she is future, she is hope. Word spread through the territory like wildfire. The Iron Duke's wife had given birth. Both mother and child had survived. The curse, if there had ever been one, was broken. People came from all over to see the baby and pay their respects. Settlement leaders brought gifts of blessing. Miners brought hand-carved toys. Even some of the stuffy businessmen who'd initially opposed Rowan showed up with expensive gifts and congratulations. Rowan received them all from her bed, the baby in her arms, Callum at her side. They'd named her Elena, meaning light, because she'd been born at dawn into a new era. "She's going to change everything," Rowan said softly one evening, watching Elena sleep. "Growing up here, seeing both worlds as normal, she'll be the first generation that doesn't remember the old way." "No pressure on a newborn," Callum teased gently. "She can handle it. Look who her parents are." He laughed, pressing a kiss to Rowan's temple. "Fair point." Silverhawk came to visit a week after the birth, bringing traditional gifts and blessings. He held Elena with surprising gentleness for such a grizzled warrior. "This child," he said, "is bridge between peoples. She will walk in both worlds, must teach her both ways." "Yes?" "Yes," Rowan agreed. "She'll learn everything, our language and yours, our traditions and yours. She'll belong to all of us." Silverhawk nodded approvingly. "Then she will be strong, like her mother." Spring arrived fully, transforming the territory into something Eden-like. The snow melted, flowers bloomed, and Viront Manor, once a fortress of isolation, had become a center of community. Rowan stood on the front steps one morning, Elena sleeping in a sling against her chest, watching as a mixed group of settlers and indigenous workers broke ground on a new school. It had been her idea, a place where all children, regardless of background, could learn together, where the next generation could build on the peace their parents had fought for. Callum came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Look at what we built," he said quietly. "Look at what we're building," Rowan corrected. "This is just the beginning." "The beginning of what?" "Something new, something better. A place where people matter more than profits, where partnership matters more than power, where a girl like Elena can grow up believing she can be anything she wants." Callum pulled her closer. "When you arrived here a year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I was just going through the motions, fulfilling an obligation. And now? Now I know my life didn't begin until you walked through those doors and refused to be what everyone expected." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "You saved me, Rowan. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," she said, turning to look at him. "That's what partners do." They stood together, watching their community work together to build something none of them could have built alone. The Iron Duke and his defiant bride, who'd started as strangers forced together by circumstance and become something far more powerful. A partnership built on respect, forged in fire, and tempered by love. Behind them, the manor stretched out, no longer a fortress or a cage, but a home. A place where two impossible people had found the impossible, a love worth fighting for, a future worth building, and a legacy that would outlast them both. Elena stirred against Rowan's chest, making small, satisfied sounds. Rowan looked down at her daughter's perfect face and thought about the world she'd grow up in. Not perfect, it would never be perfect, but better, kinder, built on cooperation instead of conquest. "What are you thinking?" Callum asked. "That I spent so long being angry about the life that was forced on me, I almost missed the life I was choosing." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "I'm glad I didn't miss it." "So am I." They kissed, there on the steps of their kingdom, with their daughter between them and their people building a better future all around them. A year ago, Rowan Ashford had been sold like property, delivered to a man known for being cold and unyielding as iron. She'd arrived ready for war, expecting nothing but suffering. Instead, she'd found partnership, purpose, love. She'd transformed from a woman with nothing but her pride into a leader respected by an entire territory, from a reluctant bride into a devoted wife, from someone who'd been told her only value was producing heirs into someone who'd rebuilt an empire from the ground up. The Iron Duke's defiant bride had become the Iron Duchess in her own right. And together, they'd proven that some cages, when broken from within, could be transformed into kingdoms. The manor bell rang out across the valley. Not a warning this time, but a celebration. The school's foundation was complete. The first harvest under the new cooperative system was being planted, and a baby girl slept peacefully, unaware that she was the symbol of everything her parents had fought to build. Rowan held Callum's hand and watched the sun set over their mountains, painting the peaks in golden rose. This land had seemed so brutal when she'd first arrived, so unforgiving. But she understood now that it wasn't the land that had been harsh. It was the people trying to conquer it. Now, working with it instead of against it, working with each other instead of against each other, they were finding that even the harshest wilderness could bloom. "I love you," she said, not for the first time, but meaning it more deeply than ever before. "I love you," Callum replied. "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us, on this impossible dream." "It's not impossible anymore," Rowan said, smiling. "We proved that." And standing there with their daughter between them and their kingdom spread out before them, with a community built on partnership and a future bright with promise, they knew it was true. Some stories end with a wedding, some with a crown. Theirs ended with the simple, profound truth that had saved them both. Together, two impossible people could become unstoppable. The Iron Duke and his defiant bride. Partners, equals, unbreakable.